Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today. We're going to give it just a couple minutes for folks to log on before we get started. Hello, all. Thanks so much for joining today. We are going to give it just another minute, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. We're going to give it just a few more seconds for folks to log on, and we'll get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Kim Johnson. I'm Policy Manager here at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. And this is, of course, our weekly, well, bi-weekly, I guess, HoUSed campaign call for universal, stable, and affordable housing. Wonderful to be here with you all. Thank you so much for joining. We have quite a few things to cover, so let's just jump on in and get started. It's my honor today to be facilitating the call, and it is my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Noah Patton, who is our senior housing analyst for disaster recovery. And Noah is going to cover some of the recent disasters that we've seen across the country. After Noah, we are going to hear from Kate Reynolds of the Urban Institute on some new research or new data that looks at the prevalence of forced moves among low-income tenants. We'll also hear our field updates, and we will hear the latest news from Capitol Hill, all coming up to you in the next hour and a half. So as a friendly reminder, if you have any questions, please drop them in the Q&A where it will be easiest for us to find. And please feel free to use the chat to say hi, introduce yourself. Thank you so much for joining. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started. It's my pleasure to welcome my colleague, Noah Patton, to give an update on the housing needs of disaster survivors in Hawaii, Washington State, and California, and the outlook for long-term disaster recovery. Noah, welcome, and thank you for joining.
Hello, how's it going, everybody? Noah Patton, Senior Policy Analyst for Disaster Recovery, the National Low Income Housing Coalition. I'm sure many people already know this, but NLIHC facilitates the Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition, or the DHRC, which is a group of over 900 local, state, and national organizations working to ensure that all disaster survivors receive the assistance that they need to fully recover. And I have the honor of leading or facilitating that work. So I've been a very busy disaster man for the past couple weeks, and looking at the weather report for the state of Florida, I think I probably have a busy week ahead of me. But first things first, as Kim stated, let's talk briefly about the impact of the Hawaii wildfires. Certainly, I've done a lot of disasters in this role, but certainly this one seems, I think, to be the most emotionally intense, I would say, based on the how quickly this fire spread. I'll just give a brief rundown of what happened, and then kind of go over some of the numbers and kind of outlooks for disaster recovery as they stand right now, still very early on in the process. So during the first couple days of August, multiple brush fires erupted on the island of Maui in the Hawaiian Islands. The island had been under a drought warning for a bit, so vegetation was dry. At the same time as these fires began, Hurricane Dora passed south of the island, bringing with it strong winds. Those winds knocked down power lines that also cut off power to portions of Western Maui. The winds effectively fanned nearby brush fires into, although they had initially been minor brush fires, they were fanned into large scale wildfires that grew exponentially in size and intensity, and pretty much leveled the town of Lahaina in Western Maui there. Emergency alerts via cell phones were issued by local emergency management authorities. However, the siren system, Hawaii actually has the largest system of public emergency alert sirens. Those sirens were not activated. The speed of the fire was such that many individuals were forced to jump into the harbor to escape the flames. Several downed power lines also blocked many avenues of escape from the area, meaning that the evacuation was even slower than normal. Many people that were stuck in the traffic jams leading outside of town ended up having the fire overtake them and fleeing on foot. So currently, as it stands, there are 115 individuals dead, though that number is still expected to increase. Search and rescue efforts are still, search efforts are still ongoing at this point. Local families of individuals who, have missing members are being encouraged to donate DNA in order to identify the bodies. Over 2,200 buildings were destroyed, with over 80% of those being homes. That number is quite high. The town of Lahaina was in a fairly remote portion of the island, so it was a large residential hub. And just to point out that it is indeed the deadliest wildfire in the US since 1918. President Biden did quickly issue a major disaster declaration. FEMA is on the ground. Primarily, those efforts right now are search and rescue and damage assessments, trying to figure out how extensive the impact actually was. Currently, there are over 4,300 individuals being housed in hotel rooms on the island and on neighboring islands. They are working to restore cell phone service fully on the island, although it is improving day by day. I'll say that the island community themselves are working via mutual aid efforts to support their friends and neighbors that were impacted by the fire. And yeah, I think it's still pretty much in, immediate response mode for that. Although, FEMA is receiving applications and everybody on Maui is encouraged most definitely to apply for FEMA assistance, because that will be very useful down the line. I'll say right now, for future concerns in terms of recovery, the water situation was already critical on the island even prior to these fires. Significant damage occurred to water infrastructure in West Maui, so there's going to be that'll be a large factor in how quickly recovery can occur. In addition, there's significant concern about predatory real estate actors looking to get their hands on waterfront property of that was destroyed by the wildfires. There's a significant concern there, I think, among the local population as well about this. Many individuals are refusing to leave the island out of concern that when they return, somebody will be living on their property or have bought it for a future hotel or something like that. So, I mean, again, it's too early to tell, and I don't want to put any additional words in the mouths of folks that have been through quite a lot this past month. But just so y'all know, like, we are working, with folks on the island, with our partners in Hawaii. And, for those that are interested, I think we'll be perhaps starting up a dedicated working group or some form of working group to assist in disaster recovery in the long term ongoing here. So just stay tuned for that via your usual Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition communication channels. Very briefly, I wanted to just talk about California. So California had a unique atmospheric situation earlier this month as well. Tropical Storm Hillary, which impacted Southern California, Arizona, and portions of Nevada as well. There was significant concern about flooding. There was significant concern about specifically unhoused neighbors in all of those areas. Those folks are significantly at risk of death due to catastrophic flooding that these storms were expected to create. The impact appears to be less severe than was initially thought. However, I'm sure it was not a fun situation for many, many individuals that were living out on the street. I did want to just send a shout out to the homeless service providers in LA and San Diego and other areas that were impacted by this tropical storm. There was a large scale kind of mutual aid effort to get folks living on the street ready for this, and certainly saved lives there. So just a big shout out to them. Going slightly northward, talking about Washington State, where several fires are burning in the Spokane region in eastern Washington. There's about 300 homes destroyed in those areas, as well as a long-term care facility as well. So just kind of continuing to track that as well. And I just don't want to make sure that those folks are not lost in the scrum of disasters, I guess, that we're going through right now. As I said at the outset, in looking at the forecast for Florida, and specifically northern Florida, between Panama City and Tampa Bay, there's going to be quite a large hurricane impacting that coastal area, forecast to be coming ashore at 7 a.m. Wednesday as a major hurricane. That means life-threatening storm surge, catastrophic flooding, strong winds, and the whole shebang. So folks should not be, I've seen already on Twitter folks saying that they're not concerned about it, but I would certainly be concerned about it if I was living in that area of Florida right now. And we'll be tracking it and coordinating with our partners down in the state of Florida to make sure folks are okay and ensure that the recovery from these disasters will be accessible for households with low incomes. I think that's about it. And also just a shout out to, I'm sure Martin has been dealing with quite a few disasters, the outcome of the Vermont flooding from earlier this summer. And certainly thanks to all the folks out there in Vermont doing the good work.
Awesome. Thanks, Noah, for that very sobering update on the various disasters that are going on across the country. A friendly reminder to folks to please pop any questions you might have for Noah or any of our other presenters in the Q&A. Noah, I do have just a couple questions for you. So one of the big issues, in most recovery efforts, but especially when we're, talking about somewhere like Hawaii or Puerto Rico, is ensuring that the voices and needs of natives and locals are centered in recovery efforts. And so I was just wondering, are there any recommendations that you would give for ensuring that the needs of natives and locals are centered in those efforts?
Well, it's a big question. So I think, operationally right now, it would be reaching out to every disaster has what they call a volunteer agency liaison, which is the person that works with the nonprofits. And most of the time it's like working with the Red Cross and things like that to organize meal distribution and that sort of thing. That'll be a good entry point into kind of the current scheme of disaster recovery and how it's going. Largely disaster recovery and response and recovery, was formulated and is being directed by like old white dudes. So typically there's certainly a large blind spot there. At the same time, I just say, I think, for us on this call, I would assume most people on this call are involved in some form of advocacy or organizing or what have you. I'd say that just kind of integrating in to your everyday efforts, like disaster recovery principles and things like that, is exceptionally useful, because even if like in the direct aftermath, like recovery takes years, so years and years, longer than people think it does. So just ensuring that you're ready to go when the time comes, and HUD long-term recovery funds get to where you're at and things like that is super important. And a good way to do that is just kind of talking to folks that have been through disasters in other areas, and certainly the Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition that NLIHC leads is a good place to do that.
Great, thank you, Noah. And a great question in the chat from Rabbi Starr. Can you give an update on the people who are experiencing homelessness who have died in the extreme heat of the Southwest? Do you know where we can get accurate reporting on their circumstances? I'm not sure if we've been keeping huge track of this, but Noah, I would love to hear your.
Yeah. That is a very good question. I do not have any numbers on that, although I will immediately following this call start looking into that issue. I will say heat has been a kind of a sticky point for FEMA and basically kind of the federal disaster response. Typically, like, heat waves are not viewed as disasters, even though they're one of the most lethal kind of natural hazards out there. And certainly when it comes to folks that are experiencing homelessness, who are even lower on the list of like things that the powers that be care about, when that combines, there's certainly a large scale lack of information about that. And so, yeah. They'll always publish the article about the hiker, but not about the folks that are experiencing homelessness. It's also difficult to catalog it because of causes of death and things like that. So there's certainly been an effort to kind of more standardize a response to heat waves, especially due to human-caused climate change, making them more likely to occur. And we endorsed a bill called the Stay Cool Act. The sponsor is escaping me at this moment, but it's probably the only bill called the Stay Cool Act currently in Congress right now that would actually kind of work to standardize the creation of cooling centers, especially in urban areas, planting of trees and additional like water stations and things like that to try and get at that. Thank you, Kim.
No problem. And thank you for highlighting that, Noah. And one other thing I would highlight too, of course, and this goes without saying, really preaching to the choir here, but the best way to keep people experiencing homelessness from dying of extreme heat exposure is, of course, to get them into safe, stable housing, quality housing that has air conditioning and other necessities as we, continue to deal with these escalating heat issues. And a good question in the chat from Esther too: how can we stop developers and foreign investors from buying up depressed properties after natural disasters? Another big question.
Yeah, that's the big one. I'll say, so currently I believe that Hawaii instituted a moratorium on real estate transactions on Maui for right now. So basically you couldn't purchase it because you can't get the title transfer and the various levers of government that are necessary to pull in order to actually buy property. It's not available to those folks. So that's one for right now. That's one thing. But, at the end of the day, it's also things like a post-disaster moratorium on evictions or foreclosures, is a significant thing that many advocates in disaster impacted areas push for. Not many get it. There are some kind of like price gouging and other regulations that are in place in like states that see a lot of disasters a lot of the time. But those are typically like only last for like a week or so post-disaster. So it's certainly not enough. And certainly we've been involved in the our bill, the bill that we endorsed, the Federal Disaster Housing Stability Act, would actually create an automatic eviction and foreclosure moratorium post-disaster. But then in addition, you have things like title documentation issues and things like that that actually facilitate that kind of like very predatory seizure of property from folks. And it's a big issue for households with low income. So you could have like heirs property, or might be occupying a manufactured home on a property and not have full title to it. So it's also a thing that I think we've been thinking about title as disaster resilience, and thinking about how to ensure that people have, the title necessary to ward off that kind of predatory real estate actions. I mean, and at the end of the day, it's also providing people with sufficient assistance that is actually accessible to fully recover, because you're less likely to, take the money, take the low offer being given to you by a predatory real estate agent or something like that, when you know that you have access to recovery resources and you'll be able to rebuild. So.
Very helpful. Thank you, Noah. And thank you too for providing, the sobering updates that we also need to hear about. And I'll flag too, just a note from Claudia Sweeney in the chat about a tornado in Detroit, Michigan, that's hit Detroit, Michigan, and caused flooding and wires down. So a loss of electricity. So a very unfortunate continuation of the disaster work that you're doing, and something else that we'll need to keep an eye on. So thank you, Claudia, for flagging that. And thank you, Noah, for joining today to provide your insights on all of the work that's being done now to help recover from these disasters.
Yeah, my pleasure. And remember, the DHRC Disaster Recovery Working Group meets every Wednesday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. So come by and we'll talk more about disasters.
That is Noah's favorite. That's what we pay him the big bucks to talk about. So thanks, Noah. And thanks to folks for dropping their questions and thoughtful comments in the chat as well. So next up, we have Kate Reynolds, who is the Principal Policy Associate for the Research to Action Lab at Urban Institute. And Kate is going to be talking about some new census data that shows how often involuntary moves occur among renters. So Kate, thank you so much for joining, and please go right ahead.
Thank you so much, Kim, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much to the Coalition for inviting me today. So yeah, I'm going to start by talking about a new set of data from the Census Pulse Survey. So starting in late June of this year, the survey fielded 2 new questions on renter stability: if and how renters feel pressured to leave their homes. And just as a reminder, the Pulse Survey started during the pandemic to analyze issues at a specific point in time using a nationally representative sample, and it's fielded on a biweekly basis. Okay, so here on this screen, you see the 2 new questions. One is about the types of pressure that renters might be facing. So the options here are: the landlord raised the rent, you missed a rent payment and you thought you would be evicted, the landlord did not make repairs, you were threatened with eviction or told to leave by your landlord, the landlord changed locks, removed your belongings, or shut off your utilities, or because the neighborhood was dangerous. And then there's 2 other options. One is that you didn't feel any pressure, and the other is some other type of pressure. And then if you did check that you felt some type of pressure as a renter, there's a secondary question, which is a yes/no, which is, did you actually move from any place you were living as a result? So the first set of these data were released just before the July 4th holiday. And we did some early analysis of the results, so I'll present those today. Next slide. Okay. So we found that 1 in 5 renter households reported feeling pressure to move from their current home during the past 6 months. Of those who did feel pressured, 40% cited increased rent as the cause. So obviously not surprising given the large increases that we've seen in rent prices over the course of the last couple of years. Another 22% of renters attributed the feeling to their landlord not making repairs, which is of concern. And then sort of at the lower end of percentages, we saw being threatened with eviction or having the locks changed at 7% and 1% respectively. However, the latter of these, having locks changed, is illegal. So seeing any percentage of that is of concern. And then of the households who experienced any type of pressure, 20% of them reported moving as a result. So these are pretty high numbers, a little bit concerning. I will say, I'm going to get into some of the details here in a second, but just wanted to say, we prioritize speed over going in depth in this round. This is the first time that these data have been asked about in the survey and reported. So we plan to do a deeper dive on these data in the next week or so, now that we have more weeks of information, just to test to see if we're seeing similar results, and also do some additional analysis. So I'll get into that a little bit more towards the end of the presentation. Next slide. Okay, so not surprisingly, when we look at the results disaggregated by race, we find that Latino and Black renters were more likely to experience pressure to move. Nearly 1/3 of Latino and Black renters felt pressure to leave their homes, compared with only 18% of white households. For Black households, the top pressures were increased rent, ignored repairs, and missed rent payments. And for Latino households, we had 2 of the same top reasons, so increased rent and ignored repairs, but they were very likely to also cite the feeling of other pressures to move. So that's of interest to us. We wish we had more information about what that meant. Next slide. All right, so zooming out to the total population again, here are some of the actions again that were cited that led residents to move. So while the percentage of renters that said that the landlords had changed locks on them was very small at 1%, not surprisingly, when those pressures did exist, renters were highly likely to leave their homes. So 61% of renters whose locks had been changed or whose utilities had been shut off, etc., reported leaving their homes as a result of that pressure. And then 44% of renter households whose landlords threatened them with eviction left their homes. So we're finding here that there are more households that leave their homes than we see in the formal eviction filing data, which I think we all knew, but now we have some data to back that up. All right, so my last point here, we are, as I mentioned, hoping to do more analysis of these data. We're hoping that we'll have enough data to determine whether there are certain patterns by household type. So for instance, looking at whether households were employed at the time, whether they feel pressured by other inflationary cost increases, looking at health and mental health status. And yes, in addition to the questions that you have, we'd love to know if you all have any questions that you'd like answered with the data that could help inform your work. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kim.
Great. Thank you so much, Kate. And again, what kind of shocking statistics, right? This is kind of the first time that the census has collected this information. So it's really the first time we get to look at the prevalence of forced moves among renters. And it's really kind of shocking to see those stark numbers of how often this occurs. And so one question that came into our Q&A is just asking where the survey was taking place geographically. And we know it's, the census data, but if you could just talk a tad about, where the federal government collects that data.
Yeah, of course. So it's a national survey, so they aim to get a nationally representative sample. In addition to that, they break the data down by all 50 states and 25 of the top MSAs, metropolitan statistical areas. Unfortunately, for this first cut of the data, I see a question in the chat about states and such. We weren't able to break it down further by geography just because the numbers were small, but we plan to, as I said, there's been several waves of data since this first publication that we did. So we do plan to try to aggregate some of the data to take a look at certain smaller level geographies as well.
Great. And we have a question from Theodora in the Q&A as well. Do the racial and ethnic demographics in this data control for income as well?
Nope, they do not. So this is just looking at, again, because the sample was small, we didn't want to cut it too many times. But we do see, if we look at income, very similar trends. So basically those with the lowest incomes having, again, much higher rates of feeling pressured. So I think there is a strong correlation between those two variables.
Definitely. And then just one more question for you, Kate. So, like I said, it's really startling to see these numbers just really illuminate a problem that we know existed, but we didn't necessarily know the extent to which people were experiencing it. And so how do you think, what do you think the implications of these findings are for how we measure eviction? Because, we have Eviction Lab doing data on eviction filings that show the prevalence of filings. But this suggests that this is occurring even more often than the data we have available suggests.
Yeah, so that's a great question. This survey is meant to really capture what's happening in a very short period of time. And so ideally, we would get a question like this inserted into something like the American Community Survey or one of the sort of longer term census surveys that really gets a sense of what's happening over time in households around the country. I think that would be an incredible resource to just that data would allow us to do more granular analysis of household types and geographies and really expand our understanding of how renters are experiencing their tenancies and the stability of their homes.
Great. Thank you so much for all of your work on this, Kate. Thank you too for joining this call. And we really, really appreciate all of the work that you and your colleagues are doing to highlight this ongoing issue and the continued need for policies to ensure renters are safe from unwarranted eviction and able to stay stably housed. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Kim.
All right. So next up, we have Martin Hahn, who is the Executive Director of the Vermont Coalition to End Homelessness. Noah gave a little bit of a preview of some of the disaster-related issues that Vermont has been dealing with, but we're going to hear more about the scope and implications for people experiencing homelessness in the state from Martin. So Martin, thank you so much for joining.
Great. Thank you so much, Kim, and nice to see everybody. And I'm on a strict 5-minute timer, so Kim, feel free to kick me off if I go long. I want to provide a quick, actually an organizational update, and then talk about how Vermont is responding to homelessness. I'm with the Vermont Coalition to End Homelessness. We are the balance of state continuum of care, working with our colleagues in the Burlington area, who are also a continuum of care. And we've been in operation for 30 years. And are now going through a merger with the Vermont Affordable Housing Coalition, who has also been in operation for 30 years. Many of you may know Erhard Manka, who was the leader of the Affordable Housing Coalition for decades. And so we're two organizations with similar but not identical missions. And the real two reasons for merging, one is organizational sustainability. It's really hard to keep a small organization going year after year in terms of raising the support to be successful. So by merging together, our impact will be greater, and therefore our ability to be sustainable, we believe, will be greater. And the voices around homelessness and permanent housing really are one and the same in many ways. We have different takes about some issues, and we're not always in agreement with each other, but we believe that by bringing our voice together under one roof, we can have greater impact, particularly when it comes to policy making. So pretty exciting, 2 30-year organizations finally coming together after a long courtship. I'm going to talk about just quickly what's going on in Vermont. So these numbers that I'm about to give are going to seem to some of you as very small. But for here in Vermont, it feels quite daunting. In what we've seen with the onset of the pandemic is a dramatic increase of people who are experiencing homelessness. So in 2020, we had 1,100 people in the point in time count who reported as experiencing homelessness. The next year, that increased by 133% to 200, and I'm using round numbers, 2,600. So, and the reason for that increase is similar to other locales. The state of Vermont opened up hotels as non-congregate shelter, and that shelter opportunity allowed people who are in doubled up circumstance, maybe weren't previously counted as homeless, were living with folks very closely and could no longer be with the onset of pandemic and congregate environment. So 133% increase from 2020 to 2021, a 7% increase 21 to 22, and now a 20% increase from last year to this year. So up to 3,300 individuals. Vermont is reported to have the second highest rate of homelessness per capita, second only to California. So our response, as I said, to the pandemic was to get people housed in hotels. And this happened in March of 2020. We had experience with this because of Vermont and our weather. We have what's called adverse weather conditions. And so if it gets really cold, somebody can be put up in a hotel. Well, the adverse weather conditions was lifted and people could stay in a hotel regardless of what was happening outside. Almost all the hotels are owned privately, and I'll say that there's been really mixed performance. Some hotels, just horrible living conditions, no refrigerator, no linens, no cleanings that are happening. And so some folks have been living in hotels for over 3 years in circumstances which are unenviable. During this period, though, a couple of the hotels have been purchased by nonprofits, owned and managed by nonprofits, and it really has sort of changed our delivery system in the state of Vermont in some manner. So we've been doing this for over 3 years. It was first funded with general funds from the state of Vermont, and then by FEMA, and then by ARPA, and now general fund. And while that sounds mechanical too in the weeds, for every change in funding, the people who are living in the hotel felt uncertainty about whether they're going to be able to remain housed. The biggest change came about a year ago. Our beloved moderate Republican governor promised to close down the hotel program and has been on a straight path in order to do that, saying we can no longer afford it. The pandemic's over, the state of emergency is over. Advocates and shelter and service providers trying to make the case, falling on deaf ears. Lawmakers said to the governor and his administration, what's the plan? Where are those 3,000 people going to go when you shut down? And there's no response. There was no plan. So this last spring, the legislature adjourned without a plan. People were to be unhoused, everyone unhoused as of in May. There was a veto session, and at the last moment, the program was extended to April of 2024, but with much more limited eligibility. So 800 people became unhoused on June 1st. And marked impact on our communities with people out on the street, and continuing through the course of the flooding that happened in early July. So the advocates are out in force again. So April 1st is not that far away. How are we going to extend non-congregate safe housing for people who meet a broad definition of eligibility? And that's the fight that continues, and how we're going to pay for it. So it's a little synopsis of what's going on in Vermont. I wish we saw a clearer path forward to continue the work that's been done, but as of now, particularly the governor's administration is standing in the way. And Kim, that's the end of my report.
Wow, thank you, Martin. And thank you for all of the work that you've been doing to make sure that people experiencing homelessness in Vermont, well, people who were finding shelter, did not fall back into homelessness. And unfortunately, of course, there were those 800 people who were still removed from that program. But thank you so much to you and all of the advocates in Vermont who are doing that work to make sure that people can find that safe, stable housing that they deserve.
Kim, if I might, I'll just say
Please.
that somebody who is staying in a hotel is considered unhoused. It's a temporary shelter option and not considered housing even from a HUD's definition. So we consider those folks to be unhoused.
An important clarification. Thank you for that. So, you know, so first, it's wonderful that this extension was granted. And again, thank you to you and all of the advocates who are doing that work. And you mentioned, you know, there were still the 800 people who lost their access to those housing units. And you mentioned that it had an impact on your community. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the impact of suddenly 800 people becoming completely unsheltered has had.
Well, the social service network has really had to step up in a way that is in some ways unbelievably great, and how ridiculous that we need to deploy food, childcare, medical assistance, all the, you know, school's about to start. And so I'm also I'm chair of the board of the local housing shelter, and the congregate, their shelter is full, 100% capacity. And so I'd say, in fact, we're not managing. Somebody put in the note, the vacancy rate in Vermont is incredibly low. Our biggest response is housing, and so the state and federal resources are being deployed to create permanent housing and permanent supportive housing. It takes years for it to come online, but it is. And so our focus is, let's find housing. But for people who are homeless today, I think it's fair to say we're failing. We're mobilizing, but it's not. This is not a way to run a humane housing program.
Definitely. Thank you, Martin. And a question that came in, just asking if Vermont State has any kind of a voucher program that's funded through the state.
Yeah, we have. There is a Vermont voucher program. We are turning particularly rapid rehousing vouchers back because there are voucher holders who are unable to get housing. That is, the fair market rents are lower than the asking rents, and then we can appeal that, and it takes time. But at this point, the vouchers are not the solution because there just is simply no housing, and so landlords can quote unquote cherry pick. They can pick people to be housed in their apartment based on how they evaluate the circumstances of that household. And so somebody who's maybe faced a housing insecurity in the past is going to be very challenged to get housed, even if they have a voucher.
Wow, that's such a great insight to a terrible problem, where so often vouchers can really help fill that gap between the need of housing stock and the availability. But like you said, when the stock just isn't there, vouchers can only really do so much.
Yeah, so to the extent there are policymakers on the call thinking about FMR reform would be of tremendous value. And I know there are some who are talking about that. And we need to change the market dynamic.
Definitely. So I think that is it for some of the questions that have come in. There are a couple that are just very specific to HUD programming that would love for you to stick around and answer if you're able. But thank you so much, Martin, for all of the work that you're doing in Vermont for people experiencing homelessness. And we'll have to have you back on to hear about how things are going.
Great, and I'll put my email in the chat if anybody wants to reach out to me directly.
Fantastic. Thank you, Martin. All right, and next we have Rabbi Sonia Starr, who is the Policy Director of Housing Alliance Delaware, to give us an update on how things are going in the state. Rabbi Starr, thank you so much for joining.
My privilege. Thank you for asking. I had been asked to talk specifically about right to representation because that was our most recent win. And we actually had 2 wins last year. One was right to representation passed, as well as a large influx of funding, the first time in 10 years from ARPA funding for new production of housing. But right to representation started before I got there. I've only been in this position 1.5 years, and it started about 2.5 years ago. And it ended up passing not the way it started. And I think that's an important part of the advocacy story. It ended up passing that you will not be a lawyer. It's right to representation, not right to counsel. So the person would be represented, would be housed within the Community Legal Aid Society. They would be trained and supervised by lawyers, but they would not be a lawyer. This was a way of keeping the costs down. The landlord must provide notice of right to representation to any household that's not greater than 200% of federal poverty. And it creates a mandatory diversion program if, unfortunately, though, the diversion is after the eviction notice is given, not before, the way we had originally wanted it. And only if the landlord has 3 or fewer, there's an exception for landlords who have 3 or fewer units and is not themselves being represented by a lawyer. What we did was notify our housing advocates of all webinars to stay educated about the changes that they happened and to report back to those who were lobbying what the response of the people on the ground were. We gave our advocates notice of hearings, tools needed to testify effectively, testified, of course, ourselves, but also helped lift up the voices of people with lived experience, and made this one of the bills that we have a yearly day for housing where we bring over 100 people to our state capitol, and we made this one of the primary, not the primary, but one of the primary bills that we advocated for. And there were really 3 important lessons that we learned. One, multi-session. We have a 2-year session in Delaware, and this one started before the end of the one session and did not pass. And that a multi-session campaign can win, that we don't have to be disheartened when our legislation does not pass through the first session, that perfection is not the enemy of the good. There are very few housing advocates that think this is a perfect bill, but it's significantly better than what's on the ground now. And that this and the ARPA funding were the first housing wins in close to a decade. Therefore, making that when housing advocates, was a real win for housing advocates to feel that when they work as a wide coalition, this was a huge coalition, we did not lead it, but we were significant partners in it. When a wide coalition across the state, different geographies, different incomes, different racial composition, different genders, all work together for the same goal, that we could beat out one of the largest associations that we constantly fight against, which is the Landlord Association. It was a huge win. So that's kind of what's been going on in Delaware, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Wow, thank you so much, Rabbi Starr. It's, sometimes it can be really bleak, the outlook of tenant rights and the affordable housing crisis and all the disasters that we're facing. And so we always love to have someone who can say, we worked together and we achieved something that will help people. So thank you so much for all of your work on that, and to the coalition of folks that you've worked with too.
Thank you.
So one question, I was just wondering, and I know it sounds like this was a recent development, but are you seeing any impacts of the program so far?
So the program had a delayed start and literally was passed in June 23. So are they taking cases? Yes, but we don't, it is officially not even gotten budgeted yet. They don't get budgeted until 2024. So I can't give you that, that answer as of yet.
Well, that just means we'll have to have you back on to give an update on how well it's going. But
Love
we
to.
do love to hear that good news. One thing that I thought was that really stands out to me too is the idea of not making the perfect the enemy of the good, and the fact that this bill, while not perfect, is still poised to really help people. And I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit to how that advocacy really had to kind of mold and shift in order to move from kind of the idealized thing that you wanted to what was able to be enacted into law.
It's hard. I'll be blunt. It's very difficult. And I think the line, where that magic line is between good is not the enemy of perfect to selling out is a very fine line and not always clear. Not all housing advocates ended up advocating for the final bill, right? There were definitely, and then we publicly said, we advocated saying this bill is better than what is, but we wish that these particular aspects of it were not included for these reasons. So we had tempered, advocacy for the bill. But for us, it was really important to keep in mind that there had not been a housing win in Delaware against the Landlord Association in over 10 years. So that's a lot. We were going up against, for a small little state, significant power. And in order to create a feeling of momentum and empowerment, we had to say this is always better. This was better than what is. We would have stopped advocating for it, right, when what was passed was worse or equal to what is. But as long as it was better than what is, we were honest about what it wasn't, and we were honest that it was better and why. And we live to fight a new day, and we have built in momentum and success against one of the largest roadblocks to any kind of tenant rights.
Absolutely. Just folks giving you love in the chat, just appreciating that framing so much. And I think the other thing too, right, is that once this program really starts to take off and we can see the benefits of it, like you were saying, Rabbi Starr, it becomes you can build on that momentum to create something even greater than, right? So this is far from, the last bite at the apple. This is a continuation of a lot of advocacy and work that has been going into making this a reality.
Correct. And one of the things we did, and if it's okay, if I still have time, one of the things we really have started to do is build what I'm calling an housing advocacy movement. When I got there a year and a half, we didn't have a list of people across the state who were willing to be housing advocate. Now, I know these numbers are going to sound funny. We're even smaller than Vermont, so give us some leeway, but some grace. But we have over 300 advocates who have signed up across the state. 50% I can document did something in the last year. That's a pretty high percentage, whether that was testify, email, come to a program, come to a webinar, did something actively. Our goal is in the remaining 3 years, I promised 5 years since I was hired, that 3.5 years, that there will be 5 to 10 housing advocate in every single district across the state. That's still my goal. So the idea is that we are really trying to build a state-based housing advocacy movement that is willing to make housing advocacy the primary focus and to be active, not just passive complainers, but active change makers within the state. And the only way to do that is adding person by person to every single locality within the state.
Absolutely. It's those, incremental steps that build into something great and that help make that change. I don't see any questions for you in the chat, but we are getting a lot of love for you and all of your work. We love seeing some good news every now and then. So thank you so much, Rabbi Starr, for joining us and for all of the excellent work that you're doing in your state and for your communities.
No problem. I'll also put my email in the chat. Anybody wants to be in touch, feel free.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining. All right, and it looks like we might wrap it up a little bit early today because I am the last presenter and I am just going to give an update on what's going on Capitol Hill. So as I'm sure folks know, it is still August recess, and lawmakers will not return to Capitol Hill until after Labor Day, but they're already discussing how to keep the federal government funded after September 30th, when a new fiscal year begins. So for just a little bit of background, and I'm sure this is redundant for some folks, but for a little bit of information on the federal budget process, which I know everybody looks forward to. But the federal fiscal year begins on October 1st of every year. So in theory, Congress needs to get together and pass 12 appropriations bills by September 30th in order to keep the federal government funded. If they fail to do so, which they have for the better part of the last, I think about 2 decades, they need to pass a continuing resolution, and that continuing resolution maintains a consistent level of federal funding for programs until Congress can pass a new budget for the upcoming fiscal year. So Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and House Speaker Kevin McCarthy both agree that a short-term continuing resolution is going to be needed in order to keep the federal government funded at the end of September and to avoid a government shutdown. So because continuing resolutions maintain a consistent level of funding, and because the cost of rent rises every year, that level funding is really not sufficient to provide for the level of need required, or to provide the level of funding required to keep everybody who is currently receiving federal rental assistance or other assistance from HUD safely housed. And so we still need to see that increase in federal funding for FY 2024 in order to make sure that everybody who receives rental assistance keeps receiving the assistance they rely on for safe, stable housing, in order to continue seeing funds go towards homeless assistance grants to help people experiencing homelessness find safe, stable housing, in order to continue the construction and development of deeply affordable housing units. You know, like we just heard from Martin in Vermont, that additional funding for the development of deeply affordable housing is crucial in order to even begin addressing the affordable housing crisis. So along with that continuing resolution, Congress is looking to pass at the beginning of October, or by the beginning of October. They're also looking to pass a supplemental spending measure to provide additional funding for FEMA's disaster relief programs and to provide some additional assistance to Ukraine. Republican lawmakers in states that have been hardest hit by disasters, including Speaker McCarthy, have also requested some additional assistance from the White House to help with those recovery efforts. But even as they request additional aid, it's not clear whether House Republicans will be able to come together to pass a clean continuing resolution and supplemental spending measure. Members of the far-right House Freedom Caucus have continued to insist that they will oppose a continuing resolution unless it includes some draconian cuts to spending and other harmful provisions that would not pass in the Senate. So we are still looking at whether or not Congress will be able to pass a continuing resolution by October 1st, or whether or not we are going to be looking at least a short-term government shutdown. If I was a betting woman, I would say that we are looking at least a short-term shutdown before Congress actually passes that continuing resolution to keep the federal government funded. I will say, however, just to kind of put a cherry on top of things of this conversation that we are having, just to remind folks that together we can and have achieved historic protections and resources for renters with the lowest incomes. And together we can continue to fight the ongoing threat of cuts to HUD's funding for affordable housing and homelessness resources. We are asking advocates to continue to weigh in with their members of Congress, to continue to use the time for August recess to take meetings with their members while they're in their districts, to tour them around affordable housing developments, or even to just meet with, their offices to talk about the impact of these programs on your communities. If, of course, you're a busy person who doesn't have time to set up meetings with members of Congress in the next few weeks, that's okay. We still have a really easy way for folks to take action. You can use the link on the screen or the QR code to send a quick email to your members of Congress and remind them of the importance of increased federal funding for affordable housing and homelessness assistance in the FY 2024 budget. That is a quick and easy way of taking action for folks who are busy with other things, very understandably so. I'll also mention too that we're hearing from Senate Republicans that they are not going to fall in line behind House Freedom Caucus's demands for steeper spending cuts. So if you are living in a state represented by a Republican, you can also call and thank them for holding the line and for not falling in line with the far right members of their party, and instead fighting for increased funding for these valuable investments. So that is about it for me, I believe. Yeah, and with that, it's 3:30. Without any questions in the chat that are popping up, we will go ahead and call it a day today. Thank you so much, Hunter, to sharing in the chat. Not a single one of these politicians deserves our thanks. You know, if you feel like thanking them, then we would encourage you to do so, but I'm also not going to argue with that point of view. So thank you all so much for joining and for your continued advocacy. We look forward to coming back in a couple weeks with new updated information. Congress will be back. We'll have exciting new programming. Thank you for joining, and please stay safe out there. Thank you so much.